The afternoon moderators, Dr. Oyekon and Dr. Mosima, we are waiting for you. It's time. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are at this moment. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this session of the Colloquium that got off on a very interesting note earlier in the day. So I will be moderating this session alongside Dr. Pius Mosima. And we will be having 4 presentations for this session. The way in which we'll be going about this, in order for us to save time, is for us to have the 4 presentations one after the other, and then we save our questions. I mean, we'll have 2 presentations first. After the first 2 presentations, we will have questions, and then we go to 2 other presentations. However, in order to make it a bit faster, I will enjoin us to make use of the chat tool, so that as the presentations are going on, we drop our questions, and then it will be easier for us to just have a few questions in addition to the comments we have dropped. So this afternoon, we'll be having Dr. Diana Eko, who will be talking on an application of conversational thinking to the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa. Immediately after Diana Eko, we'll be having Dr. Yvette Fretter, who will be presenting on philosophical misappropriation. A philosopher of education considers the stealing, borrowing, sharing, and creating of African philosophy. Each presentation will last for 30 minutes each. Thereafter, Dr. Lila Tabanero Haderia will talk on the applications of conversational thinking, the role of collective action in emerging contexts, to be followed by Dr. Aribia Atu, who will be talking on how we can overcome the problem of conversational in applying conversational thinking. So without delaying us much further, I'll welcome Dr. Diana Eko to go on with the presentation of an application of conversational thinking to the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Just a short disclaimer, I'm not yet a doctor. Yeah, so the title of my paper is an application of conversational thinking to the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa. I'll just give a brief introduction to my talk. I'll just keep the whole presentation very brief and to the point. In my presentation, I start off with giving an overview of the root cause of the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa. And in doing that, I explained or discussed the problem of racial discrimination. And then I moved on to show how conversational thinking can become a framework which can be employed in addressing the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa. The problem of racial discrimination, like I have identified in my paper, stems from 2 influences in South Africa. First, from colonialism, and then after apartheid in South Africa. You know, it started off with the problem of segregation that was institutionalized through the Land Act of 1913 that brought about separateness. However, this separateness was further entrenched during apartheid that created segregation between white and Black South Africans. And this confiscation of Black lands contributed to poverty and financial inequality between white and Black South Africans in South Africa. So this problem also further intensify racial discrimination, wherein, like I argue, has contributed to present-day racial discrimination in South Africa. Yeah, because we have the problem of exclusion and inclusion, and that who are those people that are supposed to gain from the wealth of South Africa as a nation. Hence, we see this systemic discrimination that has metamorphosed into a triangle. Yeah, I term it a triangle because it is no longer something that exists between white and Black South Africans, or those categorized as Black South Africans. And I also want to and say that when I say Black South Africans, I'm not talking about just Black South Africans alone. I mean, during apartheid, South Africans were categorized into white and Black. So when I'm talking about Black, talking about Indian, colored, or inclusive. So I'm going to move on quickly. So this racial discrimination between white and Black South Africans brought about what I term racial binary oppositions between Black and white South Africans. And this racial binary opposition sort of characterized the whole social formation of South Africa, or of the South African society during apartheid. And even in present day South Africa, we still have the legacy of apartheid still influencing race relation, and how different race group in South Africa relate with each other. So the problem of racial discrimination, like I earlier mentioned, is a triangle wherein due to the root cause of the discrimination and segregation that was in place during apartheid and that existed between white and Black South Africa. And this discrimination sort of encourages or promotes attitude of intolerance and the attitude of the inability to actually accommodate others. Hence, we have the problem of xenophobia and whatnot in South Africa. And this problem of racial discrimination, like I argued in my paper, can only be addressed, or should be addressed, using the framework of conversational thinking. And how can conversational thinking become a method, or how can it be employed in addressing the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa, and how can it also promote tolerance, promotes the idea of interdependence and mutual solidarity between the different race groups in South Africa. Like I argued in my paper, conversational thinking involves a critical and creative engagement between two epistemic agents, namely Nwansa, or the proponent, and Nwanju, or the opponent. And I also mentioned that Mmenko, which is a relationship, is a crucial infrastructure in employing the method of conversational thinking. Hence, I said that this engagement is guided by two types of motion, which is conjunctive and disjunctive motions. In the former, opposed variables come together, and in the latter, the relationship collapses and they move away from each other until such a time necessity brings them close again. If we employ this understanding of conversational thinking to the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa, we are going to, as in when we weigh it side by side, we're going to see that the tenet of conversational, the idea of racial discrimination in South Africa sort of contradicts the tenet of conversational thinking, because in conversational thinking, there is a room for complementation. And when we're talking about complementation, we are not saying complementation is just two persons coming together just to agree that, okay, we are agreeing to complement each other. The nuances surrounding it is that there must be creative struggle. It is in this process of creative struggle that these two epistemic agents can agree. And before any form of agreement can take place, there must be a change of mindset. Hence, I argue that in conversational thinking, the logic that underlies the framework of conversational thinking must first is one that gives you an open mind. It is not conceited, it is not polarized, and it is not bifurcated. It gives room where different epistemic agents can come to the table, sit, and actually analyze this. The table we are talking about is an imaginary table, although where they can actually rather agree, discuss on the way forward. And so a good example of the former, which is in creative struggle, like I said, the creative struggle is to be regulated. And how can this creative struggle be regulated? Like Chimakonan said, the creative struggle is to be regulated to avoid, on the one extreme, crossing the Pinocchio Point, where they each lose their identities, and on the other extreme, the tension of incommensurables, where they violently break away from each other. Like if we can see the problem that exists, the racial discrimination that exists, we can see that it's actually in a point or the point where these two epistemic agents are not in consonant with one another. So I liken it to the point where this tension is incommensurable. And now, how can we now bring them back together? So a good example in race relation would be a race-blind interaction between the different race groups in South Africa. For the latter, a good example would be any kind of inequality that encourages discrimination, exclusion, and xenophobia, which naturally militate against complementarity, which is a very vital aspect in conversational thinking. So if we want to apply, or I propose that we apply conversational thinking to the problem of racial discrimination. I know that when we talk about complementarity, there is this idea that complementarity also is another form of promotes another form of exclusion. However, I need to point out that the kind of complementarity that we engage with, or that is in conversational philosophy, is not one that seeks to homogenize the different identities. Rather, it is the kind of complementarity that understands or recognizes these differences recognize the differences in the different race group, and create opportunity where these differences and the positive aspects of these differences can be harnessed to move the nation forward, or move South African society forward. Hence, I argue that if conversational thinking is employed as a method or a strategy in addressing the problem of racial discrimination, there will not be we won't have the problem of xenophobia. And as we know, the problem of xenophobia is all about the fear of foreigners. Okay, the foreigners are here, they're taking our jobs, they're taking our deeds, they're taking our opportunities. I think the problem that the method of conversational thinking will give us will create the platform where we get to rethink the logic behind our ideology. What is that logic that we are working with? What is that mentality that we have that is actually depriving development and further entrenching segregation, exclusion, and even xenophobia in South Africa. So I argue that for South African society to start a to begin its journey to a non-racial society, I think it must start from one, changing the logic that undergirds the idea of racism in South Africa, which invariably promotes racial discrimination in South Africa. And secondly, the problem of poverty and financial inequality needs to be addressed. And this problem is not a problem that needs to be sorted out by foreigners, but by the South African government, in such a way that it will bridge the gap between the poor and the rich, so that there won't be this understanding that, okay, foreigners provide cheap labor and whatnot. Hence, the problem of insecurity and intolerance that promotes racial discrimination as well as xenophobia in South Africa. So I conclude by saying that in conversational thinking is a framework that creates an equal platform for these discussions regarding race relations and racial discrimination in South Africa. And if we begin to think consciously and creatively about racial discrimination, the root causes of racial discrimination, and its expressions in present-day South Africa, I think we will start by just disabusing our mind, and this the disabusing of one's mind is the first point in actually understanding what conversational thinking is all about and how it can be employed in South Africa to address the issue of racial discrimination that still exists in present-day South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Diana, you have saved us quite a lot of time while making your presentation very clear. I believe that those who have listened will have questions for you. But before we go to the questions, let us quickly listen to Dr. Yvette Fretter as she makes her presentation.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we are hearing you loud and clear.
Yay, wonderful. Okay. So my paper has had a slight change in its title, so I will share that with you. Just give me one moment. Okay, so conversational thinking, Euro-Western need and appreciation of African philosophy. As Western philosophy finally turns its gaze south to Africa, reenacting the plundering of our colonial past must be avoided. Thus, in the spirit of multicultural, cross-cultural community building, in this presentation, I, as a white African Euro-Western philosopher of education, will seek to demonstrate an appreciation, not appropriation, of new philosophical thinking coming from Africa. I will consider the applications of conversational thinking as a decolonial method in the humanities by extending Jonathan Kahneman's system of ezumezu logic. I suggest that conversational thinking can ground more than just theories in African philosophy and studies by providing a system of logic needed to undergird the intra-Western theories which work to criticize and dismantle Western paradigms. This African system of logic provides a vital matrix upon which relational epistemologies and multicultural pedagogies can do the important work of forming democratic learning spaces so needed in the diverse globalized landscape of our jingoistic post-colonial times. Not only does conversational thinking offer a necessary new system of logic, but it has a methodological component that I will conclude with in an exercise of pedagogical praxis that further demonstrates the application and appreciation of conversational thinking in classroom spaces. So there is a need for conversational thinking. As a philosopher of education, I attempt to traverse the divide between positivistic scientific research that works to determine facts that can be proved, disproved, verified, quantified, and replicated, and the metaphysical abstract theory of pure philosophy for my practice that seeks to link conceptual work to educational application. This approach affords me the license to consider what is and what should be, and try to make the case for what is the best, the right, the good, the beautiful, the fair, and the just, the true. South African philosopher of education, Yusuf Wagid, describes this approach as a philosophy of education that is more a means of inquiry and less a disseminator of objective truths. This kind of inquiry allows focused analysis of particular phenomena, such as, in my case, the philosophical examination of the practical application of conversational thinking to critical theories, relational epistemologies, and multicultural pedagogical theories and practices that foster democratic learning spaces. Let me briefly explain how critical theory, relational epistemology, and multicultural pedagogy inform my practice. Critical theory promotes criticism in the search for quality education and enables critique in order to forge alternative and less oppressive social arrangements. This is a necessary tool for dominant culture members, such as myself, to come to understand how domination and oppression occur, and how social systems influence individual experiences and vice versa. Positionality reminds us that we are raced, classed, and gendered, and that our knowledge is socially constructed. Analysis of our situatedness and embodiedness, the questions of dominance and power, and the negotiated, contested, and mediated working out of our identities is a critical endeavor. Critical theory focuses on how domination occurs, and critical theorists do the work of stimulating an individual's consciousness of him or herself as a social being. In educational contexts, this consciousness that critical theory brings helps educators see issues of power within school structures and curriculum. Relational epistemology in my philosophy of education is based on Barbara Thayer Bacon's relational epistemologies, which offers an alternative theory of knowledge, one that strives to be open and inclusive as it attempts to be self-conscious and reflective, adjustable, and adaptable as people gain further understanding. Her epistemology views knowledge as socially constructed by embedded and embodied people who are in relation with each other. Perceiving the disjoint between traditional Euro-Western male-dominated ways of knowledge that claim to value only abstract and logical thinking, this approach wishes to include what has been relegated to women and other marginalized groups such as Indigenous people. Thus, we also make knowledge in ways that are intuitive, imaginative, and emotional, and broaden the concept of critical thinking, the filtering, to what she calls constructive thinking, a process of inclusion. Consequently, epistemic communities of knowers are imagined as including teachers and students embodying every sort of difference in a process of social construction of knowledge using rationality enhanced by personal voice, intuition, imagination, and emotional feelings. Here, claims of truth are challenged and reframed as warranted assertabilities. From a point of negotiation to create knowledge, we are able, in theory, to expand the net of inclusion through deconstructing the binaries of mind and body and subject and object. So doing, the door can be opened to, for instance, communitarian ways of knowing, gendered ways of knowing, and positioning the knower in a subjective stance that relinquishes the illusion of objectivity. Relational epistemology creates the knowledge creation mindset that can foster the ideal of a pluralistic, inclusive society. Multicultural pedagogy, as it influences my practice, can be defined as embedded in sociopolitical contexts and as anti-racist and basic education for all students that permeates all areas of schooling and that is characterized by a commitment to social justice and critical approaches to learning. We see here that critical theory, relational epistemology, and multicultural education demonstrate conceptualizations regarding the theory about the nature of knowledge, how what exists might be known, and can determine what is seen as knowledge and how it is constructed. This determines how it is assumed learning occurs and what should be taught. In turn, this affects how we teach our pedagogy and what we teach, our curriculum. With this background, let us consider examples of Euro-Western theories that need conversational thinking. In her 1982 presidential address at the annual meeting of the Philosophy of Education Society, Jane Roland Martin demonstrates the problem of the binary as it pertains to gender. Attending to a dominant discourse in philosophy of education at the time, Martin unpacked the ideal of an educated person and revealed it to be an individual with a male cognitive perspective. This person was located in the productive processes of society beyond the customary female realm of homebound reproductive processes, and studied material written by men, even if the subject was woman, that exemplified rationality, thus excluding traits conventionally associated with women, such as sensitivity, feelings, emotions, empathy, nurturing, and intuition. Martin exposed the false impartiality of becoming an educated person. Equality is consequently impossible. Only assimilation and accommodation on the part of the woman will allow her to be an educated person by this definition. She must choose between the productive and reproductive world. She must hide her emotions and intuitions, and she must be judged as a woman compared to a man, not simply on her intrinsic worth. Women who do not see knowledge created in a way that incorporates emotions or intuition might feel derision and ingrained feelings of inferiority. They do not see the contributions of women in the bodies of knowledge. They feel compelled to split their bodies from their minds and their homes from their places of education. Conversely, maleness is the location of superior knowledge that is objective and allegedly created through reasoning, but usually this is nothing but dominance. Men are the major contributions to bodies of knowledge because of the marginalization of women's contributions, and not because of the superiority of male voices. Productive work is the most valuable site for education. A bivalent is established, dominated by normative maleness devoid of female traits, epistemologies, and contributions. Both men and women are victims here, limited by two-value logic and pinned in or locked out by borders. The same is true for all our unequal binaries. It doesn't take much imagination to change the gender scenario for a decolonial one. Conversational thinking offers to set peoples and cultures free from the chains of border so that unequal binaries that yield contradiction may be avoided. And the European male has to be decentered as the meaning maker. As stated, another contemporary Euro-Western female philosopher of education, the aforementioned Thea Bacon, shares her theory that we are making knowledge together in a process of inquiry that is dynamic, flexible, and reciprocal. These standpoints or particularities position us within our learning community in a collaboration of knowledge construction that is always in process. We can never fully know the view of the other, but we can seek to attempt to see the other's perspective or be sensitive to hear their opinions and seek to make meaning together. Our embeddedness gives emotional, social, intellectual, and relational context to our construction of knowledge. Appreciation of our situatedness is vital if we are to encourage sensitivity to diversity by attempting to know ourselves, attempting to know others, and to create knowledge together. It acknowledges that our positionality that we cannot be detached from the knowledge we are making. So we are not limited to just our own knowledge. We can, in relation with others, broaden our understanding to the perspective of others. Not only does our embeddedness help us connect to others, but our embodiedness help us to unite the parts of our individual identities. Acknowledging our embodiedness helps heal the split of our minds from our bodies by connecting our objective and subjective, productive and reproductive selves together. Embodiment makes for a rich place for teachers and students in a democratic learning community to explore their personal positionalities, to develop a sense of self through relationship with others, to enhance learning. For, as Thea Bacon states, we need a sense of self to become potential knowers. Conversational thinking gives this approach the philosophical undergirding students and teachers will need to acknowledge that in a pluralistic society and classroom, there cannot be a shared objective truth. However, there can be a shared subjective truth, a warranted assertability. This is vital in the winner-take-all political climate sweeping the world now as nativism, ethno-nationalism, Sexism, racism, and religious intolerance are on the rise. How beautiful to offer a third way of appreciation of difference that allows the participants to make their own meaning and determine their own world and mind views based on their own unique positionality. This is especially helpful in the teacher-student dialogue to avoid charges of indoctrination while allowing for perspectives of embodied people to be shared in conversation and understanding to be determined in private. Acknowledgement of embodiment is also a powerful tool in the dismantling of these splits as they manifest themselves in oppressive colonial, racial, gender, and class hierarchies. Current classrooms bear the fingerprints of Locke and Rousseau with what their Bacon calls their assumption that individuals develop atomistically on their own. Within an ideal democratic learning community, students will develop their ability to reason and care together by being constructive thinkers. By drawing on their personal knowledge and expert knowledge of others, these students will be able to piece together thinking patterns that appreciate both rationality and our inherent subjectivity. They will be able to investigate more deeply what they experience through attending to what they feel, imagine, or intuit. Such engagement is antithetical to the current emphasis on direct instruction, rote memorization, and limited assessment modalities, but holds the greatest potential for developing critical appreciation of diversity and equality. The competitive school culture and narrowing of curriculum makes culturally relevant instruction unlikely. However, attention to community can reduce feelings of alienation for students from communitarian cultures. We need a classroom environment that sidesteps individualistic models that focus on individuals at the expense of the group, and the social constructivist trouble that models that emphasize the group at the expense of the individual. A democratic learning community does justice to both the individual and the group by focusing on interconnected, interdependent, interactive relationship that exists between the self and the community. Here again, we see the correlation with conversational thinking that suggests that as the relationship of creative struggle brings seemingly opposing variables together, it is the relationship of difference that preserves their separate identities such that the communal values do not consume the individual endowment. The colonial educational hangovers of competition and a sense of individualism cause school environments to be alienating, hostile, and makes it even more difficult for students from communitarian cultures to succeed. As multicultural scholar Richard Milner states, since students come to learning encounters with different cultural orientations, frame of references, lived experiences, and personal styles, treating them all the same instructionally is morally indefensible. Multicultural scholars agree that a race-centered, culture and diversity-focused and multicultural curriculum are essential for student, academic, and social success, and suggest that teacher education programs provide an encompassing study of cultures, a repertoire of appropriate teaching adaptations, reflective and critical thinking, and multiple experiences with culturally diverse people. Thayer Bacon describes a learning community that would welcome second language learners in an affirming way, encourage learners of cultures different from that of the dominant discourse, and create a nurturing space for learning to occur. This space will allow for civil discourse and civic empowerment, as students will feel their value and the efficacy of their efforts and will work against low expectations and negative self-fulfilling prophecies. This nurturance of a democratic community in the classroom creates a mindset that acknowledges that each of us is a unique human being with our own specific context and different individual gifts and talents, as well as needs and limitations. And this creates a non-toxic environment where students are able to explore, relate, and connect. So what does conversational thinking bring to the table then? It does not take much to see how conversational thinking offers a theory of meaning making, or background logic, as Okola states, that creates a matrix that supports many of the ideas found in these educational theories. Thus, as Kim Akonim describes, all the principles in a theory are ensured by its background logic, and space is made for us to consider other ways of knowing, break down the mind-body split, move from an either-or to a both-and approach, solve the individual community dilemma, embrace critical thinking and constructive thinking, balance the overvaluation of reason, add value to imagination, emotion, and intuition in knowledge making, embrace pluralism without devolving into vulgar relativism, foster inclusivity and equality, change the goal of education from being the discovery of fact to that of meaning making, thus facilitating greater tolerance in increasingly diverse educational landscapes. We see in this African three-value system of logic the concept of okwu. I can best describe this as essence, that creates a new space to consider the essence of thought or people or culture or knowledge. This essence, as I see it, gives each thought, person, culture, or knowledge inherent value right out of the gate. And this is the kind of inclusivity needed in our classrooms, epistemologically and sociologically, to enact a dialogical, decolonial, and desuperiorizing outlook. Chima explains it in this way. The reason and logic that emerge from it do not discriminate against each other. They recognize the right of the other. Okwu does not equate a particular manifestation of reason with the universal or treat one as absolute. It confers equality on all, recognizes the validity of their differing contexts, and awards the character of universal to all as a common attribute. Reason that emerges from okwu is not absolute, and none of its contextual manifestations is capable of being evaluated to an absolute instance. Perhaps one sterling difference between logos and okwu, when construed as reason, is that whereas the voice of logos is a monologue, that of okwu is a polyog. While logos dictates what is scornfully regarded as the other, okwu converses with all the selves. This is more than just the old Africa catching up with the West philosophical story, nor is it that Africa can do philosophy like the West. In fact, Africa is offering a unifying system of logic that encompasses the critical theories of feminist, multicultural, critical race, post-colonial approaches that work to break down superiorist systems of inequality that, for whatever reason, often accompany Western thought. Postmodern deconstruction can carry us only as far as our efforts to decolonize and can only carry us so far in our efforts to decolonize and desuperiorize ourselves. Critical theories fall prey to claims of nihilism or anarchy, as they seemingly tumble down the slippery slope of cultural relativism. As we have seen, critical theory, relational epistemology, and multicultural pedagogy have not only revealed and challenged systems of domination and marginalization, they have also brought to light other ways of knowing. These ways of knowing need a new form of logic, one that is not steeped in Enlightenment rationality and imperial reason that they are breaking away from. This is where conversational thinking provides a kind of reason that considers both the inquirer and the responder. It holds their process of meaning making together as a whole, whereby those in conversation are able to come to a point of understanding, not domination, of what the other means, rather than understand what the message means in and of itself. Indeed, this may seem radical for those steeped in rational, male-dominated Euro-Western thinking. However, for critical theorists such as feminists, indigenous scholars, and queer theorists, this is, forgive the pun, rather logical. Conversational thinking's logic creates the inclusivity needed and the openness needed for a non-binary approach in a pluralistic and particular view of the world that seeks to undermine power hierarchies that have been used philosophically, economically, politically, and sociologically to dominate women, people of color, and the poor. It stills the complaints of anything goes by those used to the linear equation style of male Western logic, by drawing on context to make warranted assertions that are as true as they can be given the information provided. Conversational thinking offers a rigorous rationality that is able to absorb issues of subjectivity. Conversational thinking's logic also changes the question to, what does it mean to you, instead of, what does it mean? Thus, coexistence is possible rather than a winner-takes-all preposition for finding the truth, the best, the right, that is wrapped up in a dualistic hierarchical worldview. It avoids the essentialist trap of Euro-Western logic that essentializes reality in what is acceptable and unacceptable, approvable and unapprovable, superior and inferior. I argue, in terms of pedagogical praxis, that this method can be used in our schools spaces for research projects, but also for meaning-making inquiries and discussions adjusted for age. New material can be creatively presented, showing multiple perspectives, and then discussed between students who must pay special attention to context and move beyond binaries to determine for the moment what is the collective, the aggregate, the totality of all that is most viable, most potent, and most powerful, and suggest complementary point of view to the two standard values. This can be practically, yet methodologically implemented using
Dr. Freiter?
Yes, sir. Is that my time?
Could you please round up in a minute or two?
I'm done. Thank you so much. I can just show you this last thing is the Harkness Method, which you can see is a pedagogical approach that uses the methodology of conversational thinking, while at the same time providing the existential relaxation that is needed to deal with conflicting points of view for students. And so they have that matrix in the background so that they can have learning that is an equation of addition rather than attrition. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Okay, so now it's time for us to go into questions. Yeah, I can see one hand up here. Okay, Umezurike Ezugu.
Yeah.
Could you please unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you very well.
Okay, my question to Diana, the first presenter, or the last person presented. I want to ask in what way or ways do you think the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa? Okay.
I didn't quite get that.
In what way or ways? This is to Diana.
Yeah.
This is to Diana. In what way or ways do you think the apartheid policies contributed to the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa? Two, how can the idea of culturalism, interculturalism, multiculturalism, and transculturalism of conversational thinking address the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Lucky Ogbonaya, could you please go ahead with your question? Amen.
Okay. My question is directed to Diana. Diana, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I like the way you apply the conversational thinking to the issue of racial discrimination, but I have a problem. In the course of your discussion, you were like discussing racial discrimination and xenophobia as if they are the same concept. So I want you to clarify if they are the same concept or not. Thank you.
Okay, so that's another question. Okay, Arabia, please ask your question and then we'll ask for response from the presenters. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. My question is for Yvette. You in your presentation, you talked about Uku-centricism and the idea of Uku, but I didn't quite get your explanation of the concept, because it's, for me, I think it's a very enigmatic concept and many people may have their own various interpretations of what it really means. So could you please elaborate on what you consider Uku to mean in relation to the talk you gave? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll go to Diana so that she can respond to the first set of questions quickly, and then we'll come to Yvette. Diana, you have the floor. Is Diana still with us?
Yes, sorry. Yes. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions that I have received. The first question says, what ways do you think the apartheid policy contributed to racial discrimination? You know, like I explained while I was giving my presentation, that you know, the main ideology in apartheid policy or during apartheid is the policy of separateness. Hence, using the policy of separateness, the people of South Africa, that is white and black, were separated. They were separated and they were supposedly taken away from white South Africa. That is, they were taken away from towns and cities that were understood or to as exclusive preserve of white South Africans. So this policy of separateness contributed to racial discrimination, whereby Black South Africans are not allowed certain employment. They are not allowed to relate with white South African on a certain basis, and even it was as bad as determining who you relate to and who you even have a romantic relationship with. It was that bad. So I would say apartheid policy, the whole thing about separateness started during colonialism, though, but it was further entrenched during apartheid. Yeah, so apartheid contributed to racial discrimination because it was all about racial discrimination. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, so you go to the next question, please.
Yeah, your second question is how can I didn't quite get that question because your audio was kind of.
You talked about interculturalism and.
Okay, after the idea. Yes, how of culturalism, interculturalism, multiculturalism, thinking the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Even though I wasn't talking about intercultural philosophy in this paper, however, I wrote something about intercultural philosophy and how conversationalism can also contribute to social integration. And in using conversational philosophy as a strategy for to harness different cultures, I think it is, for me, it is one of the best strategies that we can employ to address the problem of cultural multiplicity. Because in conversational thinking, there is a level ground for the thriving of different cultural worldviews. However, in this level field that is created or given for the thriving of these cultural worldviews, there is a limitation to it. What I mean by a limitation to it is that you are allowed to, contribute your quota to promote the well-being or contribute towards solidarity, not the other way around. And how to say it, put it differently rather, I think using conversational thinking, I think the major thing we should draw from it when it has to do with different culture is that it creates room for different perspective. It creates room for different perspective. And very importantly, again, it is not all about homogenizing cultures. It is not all about homogenizing culture. It's all about complementing rather cultures. I hope I've been able to answer that question now. And Dr. Lucky rather asked that I was explaining racial discrimination as if, and xenophobia as if they are the same thing. For me, I think there is, I wasn't talking about xenophobia per se, I just mentioned that but for me, I believe that there is an element of racial discrimination in xenophobia. And it is the influences that stems from racial discrimination that influences xenophobia in some kind of way, particularly in South Africa, within the context I am talking about. You know, like I said, that the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa is one that I term a triangle. Why is it a triangle? Because the unresolved issue of racial discrimination between white and Black South Africa that is still influences race relation in South Africa, sort of influence the way South Africans, or let me say, Black South Africans understand or perceive Africans of non-South African descent, hence the problem of xenophobia. I'm not saying they are the same thing, but I think they are kind of, one mutually reinforces the other. Thank you very much. I hope I've been able to answer the question.
Very, very brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so Dr. Freta, could you please respond to Arabia?
Thank you. I have a very interesting question to respond to. I think the concept of Aku should probably be addressed to its conceiver, but my best understanding is, this idea of an essence, which is, and as I think about it, not to extend it too far, but it's almost like this idea of, the Trinity, right? It's this third portion, this sort of a spiritual dimension that's able to be above and beyond the essential two binaries. And so, since there is no actual translation into English and no cognates, it's really, to me, just this third portion that creates the space above the binary. And I'm sure that's probably a very poor explanation, but it is, to me, there is no word for it because we're so used to being in two different spaces. But just like, I don't know if that helps at all. It's such a great question. But it's this idea of being in a bigger space than just what Logos can offer us. So it's more expansive, if that is at all answering the question.
Okay. Do we still have any question? Do we have any more question? Okay, if we don't have any more question, I'll just make this brief remarks before our two presenters make their parting, make their closing remarks too. Dr. Freta, okay, is anybody?
Yeah, sorry. My name is Samuel Binas Sinoswala. Sorry, I was trying to raise my hand earlier, but I had some problems with that. So please permit me to ask a question, please.
Okay, quickly.
Okay, my question could go to any of the presenter, more particularly to the first presenter, Diana Ofana. I want to ask, having been able to show how conversational thinking can help address the problem of racial discrimination in South Africa using your context, how do we address a situation in which the individual now, is there a way conversational thinking could help address the problem of self-discrimination, in the sense that the individual himself is the one that is discriminating himself from the other? Is there in Tim McConnell's conversational thinking what we could call the process or the method of self-conversation that brings that individual to the consciousness of the fact that he should not exist in opposition to the other or in discrimination to the other, but rather he should attain that level ground of solidarity through embracing other cultures, and other cultural differences as against his own culture. So that's the simple question. I hope I will be understood in that.
Thank you very much. Okay, please hold on. Just hold on. You will give your response as a parting shot so that we do not have to bother you again. I was just going to start with Dr. Freta and commend her for that brilliant and detailed presentation, and then say I like the idea of opening up the application of conversational thinking to how we democratize the educational space, and then ensure that we do not privilege certain knowledge categories over the others. I believe that you have started something that is very brilliant and wonderful, and then I look forward to your final paper when it comes up. I'm just wondering, is there a way in which conversational thinking can be conversational in its approach or in its engagement with Western categories of thought, especially those that are laden with discrimination and assumptions of superiority? In other words, is it possible by the logic of what conversational thinking aims to achieve to proceed about doing away with the erroneous assumptions of Western thought without seeking to demolish, as implied in your opening statement, Western categories of thought? Or is it implied in the idea of conversational thinking itself that certain destructions have to happen in what is considered to be a form of racial logic? To Diana, I commend you too. I like the clarifications you made about conversational thinking, opening up the space and not necessarily seeking to homogenize cultures, but bringing them together in order to create a very open space for diversity. And I also love your response to Lucky's question about the difference between homophobia and racial discrimination. Yes, I agree with you that both are not the same, but we can find some interconnectedness. We see that the idea of the other, or the idea of difference undergirds both, and then ultimately they constitute threats to social cohesion. My question to you, which was what I was trying to point out in my comments to Dr. Ogbonayatu in his presentation, however, stems from my suspicion that we may be treading a path that takes us to some form of African idea of enlightenment, because it seems to me that we are emphasizing logic as the guiding principle in how people of diverse ethnic or racial origins relate with one another. And so the whole idea then is, okay, if we can just grasp this logic, relationship between different cultures will improve. And it takes me back to works like that of John Rawls, who believes that it is possible for us to have diversity and still make a stable and well-ordered society, because we have the capacity for reasonable pluralism. I would like to have your closing remark and then see how you respond to that. So Diana, you talk to us in 1 minute, give us your closing remark. If you cannot respond to those questions, you can just take them along. We'll continue the discussion after here. And then Dr. Freta too, we have another minute to round up. Thank you to both of you for those wonderful presentations.
Thank you very much. I think the first question by Nelson, he talked about how can conversational thinking address the problem of self-discrimination. I think I would like you to read Chimakona's paper on using conversationalism, as in he uses conversationalism in addressing the issue of personhood. You know, he talks about introspection and extrospection. And I also use that in talking about the issue of rape in one of my papers. So I think I don't have the time to go into that right now, but it would be best if you read that paper written by Dr. Chimakona. And the second question is, yes, the suspicion about using the logic of conversational thinking. You know, I think your fear might be the issue of universalizing the idea of conversational thinking. And I think one thing I want you to understand is that we're talking about universalizing an idea. We're talking about creating the space where different intelligibilities can thrive. So it's not necessarily trying to become the gatekeeper of knowledge or the gatekeeper of logic. It is just simply saying, hey, come, let's reason together. Let's see this thing from different perspectives and see how we take it from there. So I think that is what conversationalism is all about, or what conversational thinking is all about. Due to want of time, I think I'll just end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Freta, your closing remarks.
Yes, thank you so much. I think to answer what I believe you were asking is, what do we do when we're trying to essentially be inclusive, but there are some systems that have been oppressive and that should not be included, but actually need to be dismantled. And so I think there are two parts to that. One is, you know, that fortunately for us, conversational thinking does have in its system of logic the Pinocchio Point, right? So it is inclusive, and everyone comes in to quote ontological equal members in the network of realities. But then there is this point where mutual independence can persist, but then there becomes a stage where ontological difference sets a limit to that relationship. And so then once that point is reached, there is this transition where sort of the inclusive part then becomes where there will be times where one has to then push out certain things, right? It's this idea of cultural assets and liabilities. There's a productive bringing and contribution and hearing, and then there is a certain point where the logic self-corrects, and then we hit our Pinocchio point in terms of my understanding of what you were asking, because all things are not equal. They can be included, but we have, you know, the danger of, and that is the fine line of breaking down and desuperiorizing is how to be inclusive, but then at the same time, there must be some protections in place, and sometimes equality has to have equity first, and others have to be valued. Those that have been previously marginalized and discriminated against have to be given priority. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you to the two of you for those wonderful presentations. Yeah, so quickly we move to the next set of presentations. The first is by Dr. Lila Tabanaro Haderia, titled Applications of Conversational Thinking, the Role of Collective Action in Emerging Context, to be followed by Dr. Aribia Attu, who will be talking on how can we overcome, trying to answer the question of how we can overcome the problem of conversation in applying conversational thinking. They will speak for 20 minutes each, and then we'll have 20 minutes for discussion. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
We are hearing you and we are seeing your screen.
Okay, I hope I can actually change the slides myself as well. I did practice this yesterday. Thank you so much. I would like to share today some insights and experiences with you as someone who does not have a background in philosophy. I'm a communication scholar and a community activist who applied the conversational method, or my limited understanding of the conversational method, in a micro-intercultural setting in the real world with real people who are also, like me, non-philosophers. And in order to relay what I learned, I would like to highlight again some of the theory that we've been hearing today. As we know, conversational philosophy is all about a respectful yet rigorous exchange of ideas between proponents of various theses. And the goal of a conversational exchange is not for views to synthesize or come together, but rather to allow each proposition to gain sophistication through a constant relational process in which epistemic agents challenge and refine each other's views. And we've been speaking about this as well, about the relationship between Wanza and Wanju and the process of creative struggle. And so when we probe the validity of a thesis, we do so by considering its specific thought world or context. And we assume that truth value is contextual or located within the context of a proposition. A proposition can be evaluated true or false, not as we suppose on the basis of the facts we assert, but rather on the basis of the context in which they assert those facts. Yet propositions and theses in and of themselves are inconsequential if they begin in words and end in words. We live in an experienced rather than merely theoretical reality, so testing theses and allowing the insights gained from them or from their application to feed back into the refinement of our theses opens up a possibility for learning. So with this in mind, I asked myself, what happens when proponents of different or opposing theses take collective action together on something they fundamentally disagree on? So they do something together about it. And in order to answer that question, I want to share an autoethnographic analysis of an experience I had in an intercultural setting in Vienna, Austria, where I'm currently living. And it is here that I was engaged with encounters between two groups of youth from mixed backgrounds. On the one side, refugees who had come to Austria, and on the other, Austrians who had been born and raised in Austria. These groups explored what policy they would design in order to address how religious headscarves or hijabs would be handled in Austrian schools or educational settings and community centers. And they decided to take action on a policy for their own community center and then return to the conversation at a later stage in order to reflect on that experience and refine their epistemic positions. So I would like to discuss the significance of this joint action that they took in producing contextual overlap and thereby theoretical nearness between their positions without impeding the goal of epistemic sophistication. In other words, I propose that collective action or a shared lived experience was able to and can bring together thought worlds and realities while nonetheless enriching the conversational process of creative struggle. And I'll discuss the implications of this for conversationalism and beyond. But in short, my aim is to show that when a conversational exchange moves beyond the theoretical realm to include tangible and collective action, contexts or thought worlds may merge even where no such intention is necessarily present. So to delve into my experience took place over several weeks in the spring of 2019 at a community center in one of Vienna's culturally diverse districts. And this center aims to bring together people from Austrian and refugee backgrounds for cultural exchanges And the initiative has many components, including German lessons, the study of materials that facilitate integration. And my specific engagement was an experiment within this greater context and was based on the founding idea of that community center, which is that integration should not constitute the mere assimilation of other cultures into a dominant one, but rather that a more reciprocal and relational engagement should lead to a common, diversely textured and constantly evolving co-culture, as it were, which resembles in intention the relational trajectory of conversationalism, as I see. Having just published a paper that had introduced me to conversational philosophy, I was curious to understand how its procedural elements might work practically. So I invited 4 participants of the center, 2 Austrian, 1 Afghani, and 1 Iraqi, to take part in a series of conversations with me to explore the hot topic of what policy they would design in order to address how hijabs should be handled in educational settings, such as schools or community centers. And in each group, 1 participant identified as a man, 1 as a woman. Based on my own understanding, I then explained and encouraged us to follow a more or less conversational procedure. This meant that over several days, we worked on conceptualizing and developing distinct vantage points or theses, while nonetheless following the critical process of epistemically challenging, refining, and defending our ideas. So I was both participant, moderator, facilitator, and an observer as well. Importantly, none of us saw ourselves as formal philosophers or scholars of conversationalism. So our understanding of and experience with this should be seen accordingly, namely as that of lay women and men coming up with lay theories. During our very first encounter, I posed the question, what should a policy on hijabs look like in Austrian educational settings? And each group expressed their thoughts. Conversations began informally at first. They were not so methodical, and they included references to the ways in which people had grown up, what values they held dear, and how they saw particularly the role of religion in society. But similarities between the views and thoughts of those who had grown up in Austria and those who had grown up in Afghanistan and Iraq, on the other hand, began to show. So 2 groups began to form along those lines. And it was during our second encounter that the process of reasoning and articulating a viewpoint became more systematic and began to shape into what could be called 2 distinct or internally coordinated theses, in the sense of positions or written down statements that declared what each group believed should be the policy and what they intended to persuade others of. So the initial thesis that emerged from the group who had grown up in Muslim societies outside of Austria was that Muslim women and girls are prescribed to and should wear a hijab in Austria because godly law supersedes and should ideally inform all societal laws. And the other group, consisting of 2 people who had grown up and were raised in Austria with Catholic and non-religious backgrounds, was that Muslim women and girls in Austria should not wear a hijab because Austria is a secular state with a Catholic cultural heritage, and living here requires accepting local norms the way foreigners living in Muslim countries have to. In this conversational encounter, then, the 2 propositions in themselves became thesis and antithesis. What followed was a series of more in-depth conversations and encounters that really evolved into more courageous and continuous procedures of testing and challenging, whereby each group questioned the epistemic strength of the arguments of the other with no express intention of finding a resolution. And without my explicit invitation, participants also engaged in their own research and consulted other sources and other people in an effort to defend and clarify and revise and strengthen their position vis-a-vis the other group. So eventually they had refined their theses in this way. Group 1 said that Muslim women and girls are prescribed to and should wear a hijab in Austria because freedom of religion is a foundational principle of Austrian law. And Group 2 said that Muslim women and girls in Austria should not wear a hijab because doing so threatens children's negative freedom of religion and state neutrality, which are also foundational principles of Austrian law. So it became very legal. But the challenge we set ourselves was then to try something together, to action something, learn from that, and then come back and understand how it would affect our thinking and our theses. So we agreed to disagree on a way forward, and this way forward was that women can choose to wear the hijab, children and youth should not wear it. This was a compromise, basically, that we decided to just action and see what would happen. It was a compromise for group one because they felt that girls or the parents of Muslim girls should have some choice over whether they wanted their daughters to wear the hijab, while group two felt that not even women should wear the hijab. So the idea was that this compromise, once taken, would be actioned wholeheartedly by everyone and become the basis for further reflection and consideration. So it was carried out and tested by both groups and their peers in their community center for a period of about 2 weeks. And in this time, girls who may have previously appeared with the hijab were kindly reminded to remove it. And in the case of adults, only one woman who had previously come to the center wearing hijab had decided on her own not to do so. But it became a time of exchange where both groups engaged in conversations with one another, as well as with other members of the community center. And these were more informal conversations. And they would explain the experiment and discuss its implications as well. Returning to the formal discussion after this, I then asked members of both groups to re-engage in the creative struggle of revisiting and refining their theses based on the insights they had gained from actioning something together. And this posed a little challenging because nobody really wanted to go back to that rigorous process of argumentation. It had been quite intense, but we eventually proceeded, and each group articulated, challenged, revised, and then refined again its position. And we decided to, draw the line and say, okay, these are the final versions of our theses. The first one became Muslim women and girls are recommended to wear a hijab, but should do so of their own volition. Girls can be entirely exempt as they are not of age. And group two said Muslim women should have the freedom to choose to wear a hijab because diversity and choice are both a part of freedom. Girls should not be encouraged to wear the hijab because they are not old enough to make that choice for themselves, but should also not be judged for wearing it. Discourse should occur on a cultural rather than legal level. So this one's quite long. So in short, both groups ended up articulating thoughts that were more similar in effect than they had been before, emphasizing freedom of choice. And they were also more liberal or more moderate in language because they replaced directives, shoulds and musts with recommendations. So then the following policy was agreed on: anyone can wear what they want, basically. So in order to sort of summarize how I experienced this conversational encounter, I've drawn a diagram, and now in hindsight, I wish I had drawn it a little bit differently. So we have the two theses, thesis one, thesis two, or antithesis. And then there's a process of creative struggle up until collective action. And then we saw that the collective action sort of brought together contextual realities, thought worlds, and lived experiences, and sort of started moving closer to each other. But these straight lines are not accurate because they should really be in zigzags, because throughout the process we had conjunctive and disjunctive moments as well. So this is very oversimplified. And I have a little star at the top that is a real or an imagined point of coming together. I leave that open, but I think that there's a general trajectory that I saw that was moving together. So this experience, however modest, suggests that when those engaging in a conversational encounter accompany each other on a path of collective action related to their creative struggle, their understanding and conception of reality, or truth in quotation marks, may begin to converge. In other words, by doing together, people may end up thinking together more or less. Now, there are some theoretical implications of this. For example, considering the context dependence of value, contexts can be seen not only as relational to one another or complementary, but also as fluid or sometimes overlapping or indeed perhaps converging. And where contexts are positioned in relation to one another can change. So while sustaining a continuous clash of differing opinions is desirable and leads to epistemic sophistication, collective action may induce a coming together for the process of creative struggle as well. So in a way, creative struggle need not categorically exclude coming together. The moderation that we found in each of the final versions of each thesis did not really amount to epistemic diffusion. You can't say that these theses did not gain sophistication. They did. Rather, each thesis was epistemically enriched based on the practical experience that was gained. First-hand information had flowed back into the process of theory development and resulted in a new layer of nuance for each thesis. So sophistication did not occur exclusively through cultivating divergence, but also by allowing convergence. Finally, and in considering also macro theoretical implications, the idea of fluid and converging experiences in thought worlds contributes to alternative conceptions of the relationship between absolutism and relativism. What do I mean by that? Well, Western social theory often frames absolutism and relativism, or objectivism and subjectivism, as dichotomous. Truths are seen as either objective or absolute on the one hand, or contextual, subjective, and relative on the other. But by considering the context dependence of value as shifting and capable of convergence, this relationship can be rethought. We can consider the possibility of an absolute or objective truth, even if only as a concept, towards which nested and contextual ones gradually advance. Practically, and for macro cultural exchanges between Austrians or Europeans, for example, and their immigrant population, this can mean that groups of people can live out a very rich and dynamic tapestry of identities and values, while nonetheless approaching one another under a shared sense of humanity. And all of this transcends adversarial colonial posturing and reflects trends in decolonization that rely on relational strategies for social change. And to sum it up in the words of one participant, she said, by trying out the conversational method and then doing something about it together, we develop the capacity to have meaningful conversations. We build trust. We now dare to share unfinished thoughts and try to speak truth amongst each other. My truth, your truth, and sometimes our truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is a very, very wonderful one. I'll make further comments after listening to Dr. Aribia Atto. Thank you for that presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so for those of us who want to ask questions or who have comments, we can go to the comment section and drop our questions and comments while Dr. Aribia Atto goes on with his presentation.
All right. Thank you, Leila, for your wonderful talk. And in fact, your talk sort of dovetails into my talk. And I hope by the time I'm done, you'll all see why. So today I'll be talking to us on the topic, how can we overcome the problem of conversational in applying conversational thinking? But before we go into all that, into the problem of conversational, it is important that I give a sort of brief background as to what conversational thinking is. I know colleagues in other presentations have dropped hints at what conversational thinking is, especially Dr. Lucky. So mine will just be a brief recap of what I consider to be conversational thinking. Now, conversational thinking began with the works of Jonathan Chimakonam, at least the systematic version of conversational thinking. And through my reading of his work, I realized that his idea of conversational thinking is closely related to, or maybe even originated from, his idea of interrogatory theory, which basically involves the deconstruction or the construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of ideas. That was his idea of interrogatory theory at the time, sometime in 2014. But the idea of conversational thinking did not begin with Jonathan Chimakonam. It began from his communal worldview and from the views of what who Asuzu calls anonymous traditional Igbo philosophers of the complementary school of thought. This is where the idea of ezumezu, which is the logic that undergirds conversational thinking, also sprang from. So it also has its ancient roots in traditional African thought. Now, conversational thinking is grounded on the principle of arumaruka, or arumaristics, which is an anglicized corruption of the word arumaruka. And arumaruka is basically the idea that you have two competing ideas, labeled Nwansa and Nwanju. Now, the English equivalent is you may call proponent versus opponent, or you may say thesis versus antithesis. Now, these Nwansa and Nwanju are locked in a conversational encounter, in a conversational relationship, where these different contexts begin to come together either in the conjunctive mode in terms of complementarity, or they go away in the contextual mode or the disjunctive mode. And it is important to note that in conversational thinking, this conversation, this constant conjunction and disjunction of the Nwansu and the Nwanja is a continuous process that, by all intents and purposes, does not really end. And the reason why it doesn't end is that unlike the dialectic moves of others like Kant and Hegel that Emmanuel Ofoasia spoke to us about earlier, there is no attempt, or there is a feeling that you must not achieve a synthesis and that the conversation must always continue. And this is where the idea of the Pinocchio point that Jonathan so very well expressed in his works comes in. Now, the Pinocchio point is the highest point of convergence in a complementary or conjunctive mode in a conversational encounter. And according to the view, once you cross the Pinocchio point, you begin to encounter problems. And this is where the idea of conversation comes in. And I'll explain what conversation means. Now, the idea of conversation is a very, very recent idea in the literature. In fact, no work has been published on the idea of conversation, but there is a draft document by Jonathan Chimakonam where he touched on the problem of conversation and debate. So what I express here is my understanding of what the problem of conversation entails. And to understand it, we must start from its etymology. Etymologically speaking, it is derived from two words, conversation, which is an English word, obviously, and und, which is a German word for and. And together, conversation would mean conversation and something else. Now, it might sound like a corny construction, but there's a reason why it is expressed as conversation. So conversation encapsulates all the problems that begin to emerge when one crosses the Pinocchio point and achieves a synthesis. And now it is important to understand how you identify when you cross the Pinocchio point, or the nature of conversation in itself. Now, you know that you've crossed the Pinocchio point when you find out that in the conversational encounter you're looking at between the Nwansa and the Nwanju, that there are no longer conversations involved. What that means is that there is the feeling that meaning has been made, meaning has been achieved. Both Nwansa and Nwanju totally understand themselves in such a way that there can be no conflict anymore. For me, that is practically an illusion. And this is where, and the reason for this is simple. You have to go back to the idea, Chimakona's idea of uku, in his uku-centricity. That's why I asked Freta the question I asked her, because I wanted to also see her own idea of uku. In my own view, uku, in the way Jonathan couched it, he said that it is proto-word. It is something that predates word language. It is something that predates logic. It is the raw material with which words and even logic is formed. So in my thinking of this interpretation or this definition of uku, I crystallize the idea of uku to mean nothing more than a vantage point, an individual's place in space and time, his perspective, the history that informs his intellectual thoughts. And it is from this raw material of context, history, perspective and all that, that the individual forms his opinion, he forms his language and forms his logic. Now, two individuals can never occupy the same place in space and time. That will contradict the law of identity. And so if this is the case, if it is the case that two individuals cannot occupy the same vantage point, then it means that two individuals cannot have the same perspective or the same ideas about reality. Don't get me wrong, I am not saying that people cannot have similar ideas. It is very possible to have similar ideas, but it cannot be exactly the same ideas or the same thinking or the same thought pattern or the same way of understanding reality. And if this is the case, and if two individuals ought to have different perspectives, then they cannot agree on everything. So the issue here becomes crossing the Pinocchio point, implies the idea that there is meaning making is false, because two individuals cannot have exactly the same ideas, the same perspectives about reality, even though they may have similar ideas about reality. So that's one way you've crossed the Pinocchio point, when you believe that there are no longer conversations to be had. And the second way you can know that you've crossed the Pinocchio point and entered into the realm of conversational is when you look at a conversational encounter and you no longer find two theses, that is the Nwansa and the Nwanju, but you find one grand thesis. And this is characteristic of the problem of conversation in conversational thinking. Now, there is a common misconception that one might have listening to this. There is another way where you can look at a conversational encounter and find only one thesis that is not conversational. And this is the idea of the nil point or the normal point. This is a situation where in the conversational encounters, the ideas, when one thesis deconstructs the other, the ideas are shared up to the point where a particular thesis no longer has content. I'll give an example. So say the geocentric view of the world in relation to the heliocentric view, which was a predominant issue in the 14th and 15th century and all that. Through the interrogation of the geocentric view by the heliocentric view, the geocentric view was deconstructed in such a way that the geocentric view today has no real content, because there is nothing in it that is justifiable. The Earth is not the center of the solar system, talk less of the universe. So when there is a conversation between the Nwansa and the Nwanju, where the Nwanju interrogates the Nwansa to the point and deconstructs it to the point in which there is no content anymore, and you have only the Nwanju standing. That is an example of a situation where there is only one thesis in the conversational encounter, but it is not the problem of conversation. It is not a crossing of the Pinocchio point. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, you now see how the idea of conversation, its etymology, derives its power. Because even though that single synthesis that we are talking about, that grand synthesis that is problematic, is beyond the Pinocchio point. We cannot deny its conversational starting point. But we cannot also call it conversation once it crosses the Pinocchio point. It must be something else. So the formally corny construction of conversation or conversation and something else becomes very enlightening, because while this synthesis emerges from conversational thinking, it goes beyond it and becomes something else. So it's conversation and something else. So how does conversation manifest itself? It manifests itself, like I said, when actors begin to believe that they've understood themselves totally. And like I have explained, that does not seem to be possible. Also very important is the way that manifests itself in the subversion of context in a synthesis and exposure to the very real possibility of hegemony. Because if you come to think about it, when you have a synthesis or an agreement of that nature, it means there was compromise. And what does compromise mean? It means a breaking of the bones of different contexts to accommodate other contexts or another context. And that can have really terrible implications. I'll give you an example, the famous example of the colonized and the colonizer. In Africa, the Western context and the African context was forced into an unholy synthesis, an unholy alliance that today we are still talking about in terms of decoloniality, something we need to break away from. That is an example of a synthesis that the conversation that does not work, And this is something that happens when we begin to cross the Pinocchio point. We believe we've come to an agreement, when in fact, what we've come to is a sort of compromise, toleration. There is a subversion of context, individualities are lost, and this exemplifies the problem of conversation. So it's once you cross the Pinocchio point into synthesis of conversation, you don't have agreement. What you have there is nothing more than subservience. Now, how do we overcome the problem of conversation? Overcoming the problem is a very simple, it's only one thing you have to do to overcome the problem of conversation. And it's so simplistic that you might even think it is too simple to be true. But before I go into that, before I tell us how to overcome this simple way of overcoming the problem of conversation, we must understand that solving the problem of conversation while remaining in conversation does not really work, because it is the crossing of the Pinocchio point itself that is where the problem emanates from. That is where the problem springs from. So you cannot be in the problem and then try to solve the problem while still remaining in the problem. And we must have that understanding if you want to. So it is not a matter of solving the problem for me. It's a matter of avoiding the problem. And from here, you can begin to see where I'm going to. So avoiding the problem of conversation simply involves avoiding to cross the Pinocchio point. And under this solution, this idea is made more profound when we understand the problems that crossing the Pinocchio point entails, and which is what I've said in the previous few minutes. So in the conversational encounter, even though it is possible for one to cross the Pinocchio point, one ought not to do so. And this is a normative, almost the categorical imperative of the conversational school. And this is why we always say the conversation encounter continues, because each context must continue to exist. And if each context must continue to exist, they must have some differences which they must converse about. When we come to a point where there is only one thesis remaining in the conversational encounter, it should only be when we achieve the new point or the normal point, where through the construction and interrogation, an unviable position is left with no content. But beyond that, once you begin to converge or complement each other in such a way that it moves beyond complementation to synthesization, then you've landed yourself in the arena of conversation, and this is what we should avoid. So far in this talk, I have tried to give a brief overview of conversational thinking, also tried to describe the problem of conversation, and also given the very simple way of overcoming, or rather avoiding, the problem of conversation, which is by not crossing the Pinocchio point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Arabia. I enjoyed your talk, just like the one before yours. Yeah, so it is time for us to engage and ask questions. Okay. Again, we begin with Mezurike Ezugu. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I want to thank Dr. Arabia for his wonderful presentation. But I have some issues over his presentation. In his point, he said that when you talk, he said that he's looking at Pinocchio Point as a point where the two epistemic agents, where meaning within the two epistemic agents and their argument can be established. But I don't think that is quite right. In Chimakonam's work, it is a point where the two epistemic agents can no longer relate. Yes. At this point, the conjunctive motion becomes disjunctive for more robust engagement and encounter. In fact, I see Pinocchio Point as a point of kinesis. That is a point of no return or reunion. But in Arabia's presentation, Arabia look at this as probably that if you crosses this particular point, that probably there won't be any meaning and all that, over the engagement and argument. But I don't think that is true. I'm looking at it that the idea of crossing this point, is for more engagement and encounter. Because even in conventionalism or conventional thinking, we talk about meaning making, not meaning, so to say. So if Arabia is telling us that there's no need, of going beyond this Pinocchio point, it shows that the conventional thinking itself, that is endless in its inquiry or exposition of thoughts, who becomes something probably that seeks for consolation, something that seeks for submission and all that. But I don't think that's what conventional thinking is talking about. I think the need, to move beyond this Pinocchio point is what actually it makes conventional thinking a unique, philosophy.
All right, thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
I think you got that. Okay, so we go to Lucky and then we go to Ernest.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Doc. I want to make comments with respect to the presentation of Dr. Leila. I appreciate the fact that she is not a philosopher, or you're not a philosopher, and you're diving into philosophy, to pick philosophy up and employ it in an area or of collective action. It's a good one. But I think there's a need to really deepen your argument by looking at the concept of autocracy, which is also a principle, the principle of autocracy. It will help you to understand wherein the argument is that authority lies in the group. So if you're talking about collective action, you need to look at the group. Your concluding remark tells a story, but if you employ this autocracy principle, it will help you to bring out your point better. Also, let me go to Dr. Arabia. I have two problems with the Arabia presentation. One has to do with his topic. How can we overcome the problem of conversation in applying conversational thinking? This topic presupposes the fact that there exists the problem of conversation in conversational thinking, but that's not the case. Conversational thinking abhors conversational, because at the moment we get into conversation ends, and there's no further conversation, there's no further discussion, there's nothing to discuss about because we've come to agreement and we said, okay, this is our position. But in conversational philosophy, we don't come to conversation. So your topic itself is problematic and your presentation reflects the topic. If at all, you in the course of applying conversational thinking to any existential problem and comes to a conversation, it's a misapplication of conversation. So you need to think in that light. It's like you're imposing what is not there, because conversational thinking already abhors conversation. So for anyone to employ it and arrive at conversation, the person is misapplying conversational thinking. Then the second problem lies with your definition of a romantic relationship that exists between Nwansa and Nwanju. And you are just presenting it as if you said that here we have two contesting ideas, and you related the two contesting ideas to Nwansa and Nwanju. I think it's a misrepresentation of thought. Nwansa and Nwanju are not contesting ideas. They are contestants and protestants. These are two different things. They're not, the ideas promoted by them are not thesis and antithesis. There's always a position that the other comes to critique, look for fault, and then reconstruct it to have another. So there's no point that you say that there is an antithesis to the first position that is posited. So I think you should think about correcting that misconception. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so Nelson.
Okay, I want to especially appreciate and thank the presenters, the two presenters. But my question now, it goes to Dr. Arabia. I listened to your presentation, quite a thought-provoking one. And then I'm wondering, you know, when you talked about the Pinocchio Point as the limit in a conversation, and I'm wondering if, according to conversational thinking, that the purpose is not to result into a synthesis, but rather the meeting, the interaction of ideas and the generation of concepts and opening up of new vistas to knowledge. Now, if we take recourse to the previous historic origin of philosophy, where philosophers, they converse for conversion's sake, where they reflected about reality for just its sake, philosophy for its sake. Now, what is the goal of conversational thinking? Is it just in development of concept for to what end? You understand? So evolution of concept to what end? The idea of generation of new vistas of thought to what end? So what is, I am thinking that there should be, you know, a central, you know, final point, you know, which I don't know whether you understand what I'm saying, but I'm just thinking out loud. You know, conversation to what end? Generation of new concept to what end? So that's just my question. If you can help me and react to that, thank you. And shed light, possibly.
Okay, so we'll take responses and then we'll go to more questions. Maybe we should let's start from the first presenter, and then we'll come to Arabia.
Thank you so much. There wasn't really a question for me. There was a comment about the concept of authority lying in the group. And I would love if, Lucky, you could send me the spelling of the name of that concept as a comment. I would love to look that up. That would be very wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to send it now.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right. I got quite a few questions. First from Dr. Mezurike. I think his question is his problem with my definition of the Pinocchio point. Perhaps we have two different visions, but you and I are saying the same thing. Yes, you can imagine yourself in a country with borders, and then once you cross that border, you go into another country. Now, in the conversational dialectics, where there is a movement from disjunctive to conjunctive motion, back to disjunctive motion and all that stuff, crossing the Pinocchio point simply means going into the conjunctive mode, that is the complementary mode, so intensely that it no longer becomes complementation, but synthesization. I said this in my talk. It doesn't mean that once you go to you achieve complementation and then you go back to disjunction, you are going beyond. That is not what that is not how I am thinking. I am thinking that in the conjunctive mode, when you are in complementation and then you begin to, become subservient, when the two ideas become of viewpoints, the Nwansa and the Waju, begin to complement into a synthesis or begin to transform into a synthesis, then they've crossed a level, they've crossed a point and gone beyond that point. And that point for me is the Pinocchio point. And if you read Chimakonam's work 2015, 2016, 2017, or all his works on conversational philosophy, you would see this point that I am making. I am not taking out of the blues. To Lucky's point, yes, the title of my work might be problematic. Yes, it is true that once you go beyond the Pinocchio point into conversational, you are no longer doing conversational thinking. I agree with all that. But why I coined the topic that way is because it is very easy, for conversationalists to fall into this temptation of crossing the Pinocchio point. It is a very real and present danger if you're doing conversational philosophy. So perhaps the way I coined the topic may not have, been appreciable to most people who are conversationalists. But it is also true that conversationalists might make that mistake. And it is also true that making that mistake of encountering conversation or going into conversation is no longer conversational philosophy, but we must admit that it is possible to make that mistake and then find ways to avoid it. So I'm not creating a problem out of the blues. Then, Dr. Lucky, you talked about the ideas of Nwansa and Wanju, that whether they are not in contestation or something like that, or they don't capture, they are not two ideas or something like that. But in my view, the way I am thinking, the creative struggle between Nwansa and Nwanju, even though one is a proponent of a thesis and the other one is the interrogator of that thesis, even the interrogator is coming from a context. He is forming his interrogation from a pool of ideas. So in a way, it doesn't have to be, the conversation must not be between two individuals. It can be between two schools of thoughts. It can be between two individuals. It can be between an institution and another individual who is interrogating that institution. That is my own vision of Nwansa and Wanju. And it is their interaction between each other that ensures the creative struggle that conversationalism is all about. So that's my own thinking, or where I'm thinking when I made those comments. And then Nelson said his question is basically, what is the point of conversational thinking if the conversation never ends? Well, logically speaking, using the logic of Ezumezu, the conversation cannot end. You know, the conversation must always continue because there's always going to be a disagreement between Nwansa and Nwanju. And in the creative struggle between Nwansa and Nwanju, new vistas of thought emerge from this contestation. And this is very important, okay? Because you begin to have a refined perspective about reality from your own context when you engage in conversational encounters. And I think that is in itself worthwhile, you know, because you begin to understand reality, even though you may not have an objective view of reality in its totality. Yeah, but from your own context, you have a much more refined view or refined understanding of reality. And I think that is worthwhile. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Christiana and then Ima, let's have your questions or comments in that order, please.
Thank you very much. And I think it's the right time for me to comment with the last comments that Aribia made. And first is that we treat Nwansa and Nwanju as permanent positions. So somebody talked earlier about loss of identity. And I didn't want to comment because I had already commented earlier in that session. So this Nwansa-Nwanju relationship is not a permanent relationship. So long as we are talking about new vistas of thought, and so long as we are talking about interrogation. So each thesis somebody puts up, so the other party is going to answer. It doesn't matter whether it is in the body of embodied in the institution or embodied in the individual. But for the fact that it is an interaction, so these positions changes. So when I listen to the discussion, I feel like we run the risk of taking these two positions as permanent positions. They're not permanent positions. Nwanju can become Nwansa at another point, whereas Nwansa can become Nwanju at another point. Now, somebody remarked and encouraged Laila to look at Ohakarase. I will say my objectivity because Ohakarase is different thing from my understanding from conversational thinking. And this is that. Ohakarase is something like it can lead to hegemonial majority, okay? And which is what conversational thinking is trying to avoid in this context. So, and I will say that conversational thinking informing collective action had to do with this participation and interaction that produces new ideas, new thoughts. Of course, if you apply it in the context that Laila applied it, we will now see why when people understand their common purpose. And in this context, conversation at that point does not just end as conversation, but a new idea has emerged for mobilizing of collective action. So, but if we reduce it to Ohakarase, it becomes a synthesis, okay, where we run the risk of forming a majority opinion that can also violate the principle of conversational thinking. And then the last comment I will make is the difference between disagreement and understanding. The whole idea, my understanding of conversational thinking is trying to understand each other. So understanding doesn't mean that we have ended the conversation, but that we are even asking ourselves questions that the interrogator is asking means that there is a level of understanding that is going on in the presence of disagreement. Okay, so, but again, we treat conversational thinking from some of the remarks here as if it's directed towards an agreement. And that's why I love what Ofasa said earlier when he was making his presentation about, it's not about synthesizing, it's not about a process of Complementarity is not just for us to find a common position, or a compromise.
Okay. Could you please sum up and so we can.
Finally, let me just sum up. Sorry. The search for truth is different, and when we compare it to the search for a democratic answer to our crisis, to discussing publicly how to govern Nigeria, how to address the problems of conversational school of philosophy. So conversational thinking takes place, and that's why I love the applications that Yvette and Laila made here. There are different contexts where you apply it, and in some contexts, you reach a point where a different issue emerges, and in some contexts, the conversation continues without end. So that is my comments.
Oh, okay. Emma, please go ahead with your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead and just let's go straight to the question. Right.
Yeah, it's a comment I want to make. Thank you very much, Dr. Eko, and congratulations to Laila and Dr. Arabia for their wonderful and thoughtful presentations. I think I want to respond to add some comments to Arabia's position. First of all, when I saw that topic, I was confused, perplexed, because I think the topic should read how we can overcome the problem of conversational. How we can overcome it, not how can we, all right? Because for us to understand how this is possible, I think we should look at Chima Kunam's idea of conversationalism as a theory of meaning making. And in this process of meaning making, there's an engagement between two epistemic agents. Now, take a look at this cup with me now. This is the lowest point of which this engagement can happen. This is the point that we call that distortions in meaning can occur. And this is the highest point, this is the Pinocchio point. So all of the conversations that will happen between the two epistemic agents will be between here and here. And so what Arabia should be discussing is how we should stay within this limit and not how we can go without it. Thank you very much.
In your example of colonization, Dr. Arabia, yeah, before you, there is a question also from Dr. Feta in the chat box. How does not crossing the Pinocchio point look like in your example of colonization? I think you will take that along the other questions in your response.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Christiana, Emmanuel, and Yvette for your comments and questions. I agree with your comments, Iman, Christiana. For Iman, the last point about how we can remain within the, I think that is the whole point of my talk. I have not claimed that we should go beyond the Pinocchio point, but also we must not forget that in conversations, there's always the movement between the conjunctive and the disjunctive moods and all that stuff. Yeah, so, but I agree with your other points. Perhaps I will need to change the title as you suggested. That is not a problem. To Yvette's question, how does not crossing the Pinocchio point look like in your example of colonization? Not crossing the Pinocchio point would mean a creative struggle between Western culture and African culture without the forced imposition of one over the other. You know, in literature about Egyptology, for instance, we find conversations between Greek philosophers and Egyptian philosophers that continued. It wasn't an imposition of one over the other. And then the exchange of culture and all that greatly improved both civilizations, if you ask me. I know, but in terms of colonization, there was no option for conversation. It was something that was imposed and mostly forcefully on Africans. So in the first place, it wasn't even a conversation to start with. There was no crossing of the Pinocchio Point. The colonizers jumped the conversational process and landed in conversation without even going through the conversational process. So it was an imposition. Now, so it is not like there is a crossing of the Pinocchio Point in this instance. It is just that the Pinocchio Point was the starting point of colonization. So if you want to talk about conversations between cultures, then in the context of colonization, then we wouldn't be talking about colonization in the first place. We would have been simply talking about the creative struggle between one culture and the other. Okay. So for your question, I think what the colonization itself is what Pinocchio Point is. And there's no going back because there was no conversation in the first place. Okay, so that's what I think about, those are my thoughts about your questions, and I hope I answered it.
So if I may put a question to the two presenters, Dr. Aribia and Dr. Leila. So I would like to ask the two of you whether you find some point of intersections between your two ideas. How do we have conversations in way that are, experiential, and to the point of moving our application of conversation thinking from theory to practice, as demonstrated in the experiment carried out by Leila, and what challenges are there alongside the prospects in the light of what Aribia has described in his analytic presentation. So I'm trying to find some point of engagement and conversation between the two presentations. I don't know if either of you would be willing, or if would be willing to make a comment in respect of the presentation of the other person.
Which of us should go first?
Oh, either way.
Either way. I mean, all of these presentations gave me so much to think about, and my mind is still spinning. I think there are so many points of intersection, but I think this idea of experiencing a conversation opens up all these new questions. So for example, one of the questions that kept coming up for me or for us was, how do you measure the sophistication of a thesis, the fact that it has evolved, that it's becoming refined? The actual process of applying this method is much more messy than the theory of it. And yet my experience was that it works, right? So it's operational. And also another very important thing that I think Christiana made me realize is that when we talk about synthesis, we're very often talking about that thought level, the thinking process. Whereas when we're talking about we introduce the dimension of collective action, we can see, maybe we need to find another word for synthesis, but we're finding something new emerging that's perhaps coming together. But it's something new. It's the birthing of a new concept, perhaps, or something that's co-created, and that's different from synthesis that happens on the level of thought. So that dimension of practicality, I think, is something that is becoming more and more important to really look at this application in the real world, and understanding how the various different theoretical considerations look and are experienced.
Okay. I think Dr. Leila's talk was quite fascinating because it showed like practical applications of conversational thinking in real world situations. You know, in her example, we saw the creative struggle between the immigrants and the host communities, as the Austrian, the teenagers from Austria and those from Afghanistan and all that. You know, but what struck me the most in Dr. Leila's presentation is, you know, like in her diagram, that star, that compromise. And I wonder, you know, if that compromise, that singular idea that appeared at the end of the conversation, if that is not an example of conversation. It would be interesting to see her views on that, you know, because I mean, yes, the ideas that was expressed, you know, that idea at the end was, you know, it's a good idea, but does it subvert the, you know, cultural context from both parties? Is there a sort of some sort of subservience, like I said, where the immigrants in this case had to adjust their views, not because of any great logical point, but because they wanted to, you know, belong in that society. You know, so it's not a matter of logical, you know, coherence or whatever, but it's a matter of survival. You know, so I'm wondering if she thinks that that final point, that star in her diagram, is not conversational, and why? That would be my point of conversation with Dr. Leila.
Leila, you want to respond?
Yeah, maybe I'll respond briefly. It's obviously very, very exciting, and it's something we could talk about more. My initial impression is that, you know, that the cultural reality or the perceptions for both groups changed based on the experiences that they gained. And I think it's impossible for anything to remain stagnant. There's always some kind of movement and refinement, right? So that we're always going towards sophistication. But is sophistication always separate, or does it have a trajectory? And that star that I put there, that point of convergence, to me was more of a elusive concept of truth, because I don't feel like they really overlap. It's not like both theses were exactly the same in the end. I think that the actionable step became one and the same, but the reasons behind that actionable step were still distinctive. They were still nuanced and textured. They were not the same. So I see that point more as a symbolic point rather than a necessarily practical one. Yeah, I don't know if that.
Yeah, sure. I think I understand what you mean. But I think the fear still remains, because like you said, that point is very nuanced. There are many things that are hidden, and that is the problem with having a broad, how do I say, a single definition for something so complex, because there are many points of, even within that agreement, there are if you go to each party, there are still points of disagreement between. So it doesn't, for me, I wonder if that action plan, that point of convergence, fully still captures the fact that these are two still, I don't want to say opposing, two different ideas and all that, viewpoints and all that. And if having that actionable plan does not in some way remove the different context involved, set it aside just for the common goal of some form of action plan or convergence, but I'm thinking out loud, and we can always have this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much. The conversation will continue. Dr. Aribia, in a minute, I want you to respond to a question from Vanessa. It says, is there perhaps a connection between not crossing the Pinocchio Point and the Confucian tradition of generating harmony, constant negotiation, that is, in relationships? If you can respond to that in a minute, fine. If not, we'll just move on.
Well, I can make a comment. I am not well versed in Asian philosophy or Confucian philosophy, but if harmony is thought of in terms of complementation, rather than the idea that different variables can suddenly become one singular grand variable, then I would say harmony in terms of complementation would work in the conversational sense, because of course, even in complementation, context still exists, and it is this context that are still in this creative struggle between each other, that are still, in a complementary relationship. They don't lose their identity. So for me, if there is no loss of identity in what Confucius calls harmony, if it is not the idea that you can synthesize different variables into one grand variable and live happily ever after, if that is not what he means, then I would accommodate his idea of harmony within my own views about conversationalism. I don't know if that answers your question, but I have very limited knowledge of Confucian philosophy.
Thank you for that. Lucky, in 30 seconds, can we have you? I'm seeing your hand.
Yes, it has to do with Dr. Arabia's topic. Based on Ofosia's comment and his reaction to it, I think the topic should rather read how we can avoid the problem of conversational in applying conversational thinking.
Okay. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Please keep your topics coming in. I'll choose one and move forward.
Okay.
Wow. Okay. So it's been a very great time here. Over the last 2 hours, we've had 4 very wonderful presentations, from racial discrimination to education and democratic space. We've had about the experimental application of conversational thinking, leading us to issues of affect and feeling. And then we've talked about conversation within the context of conversational thinking, and the Pinocchio Point has been a great point of critical engagement between the presenter and the commenters. It's been eye-opening and interesting, and I've had the pleasure of being your moderator here. So as I hand you back to the convener, I'll call on Dr. Aribiato to quickly run us through what the schedule looks like for tomorrow. and then we can call it a day on this wonderful note. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Yekan, for moderating this afternoon session so eloquently. Tomorrow we will be here again by 8 p.m. 8 a.m. Nigerian time, 9 a.m. South African time. And our moderators for the morning session will be Dr. Samuel Shegun and Dr. Osita Najiofor. We have presentations from 8 a.m. till about 12:55 Nigerian time or 1:55 p.m. South African time. So let's turn up early so we can start on time, and finish on time and have the full length of our break and not have to cut off anything or rush people. So let's come out on time. It promises to be a wonderful discussion. It promises to be very interesting, as you can see from today's colloquium, today's presentations and questions. And it promises to be a very good intellectual exercise. And tomorrow will be the climax of this colloquium event. So I'll hand you over to Dr. Jonathan if he has any closing remarks. If not, we can end the meeting. Okay, Dr. Jonathan has no closing remarks, so we can end the meeting. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Special thanks to the convener for this event, for our hosts, for hosting this event, the Center for Interdisciplinary and Intercultural Studies, Eberhard, Karls, University of Tubingen, Germany. Thank you for hosting this event. And we hope to see you tomorrow. Please attend on time. Thank you very much.